CSDE. We're very pleased to have you with us today for our Friday seminar. We have a wonderful guest speaker, Dr. A.R. Siders. And before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge first that we are located on the Coast Salish territory, the traditional territory of the Duwamish, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations and other Native peoples. This land acknowledgement is but one small gesture in the ongoing process of working toward repairing and sustaining relations with the Coast Salish lands, waters, peoples, and their other than human kin. CSDE's commissioned logo from Native artist UW Professor Marvin Oliver acknowledges these vital connections to Native peoples and territories. Second, we'd also like to acknowledge that we are extremely grateful for support from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute for Child Health and Human Development, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, the School of Public Health, the School of Social Work, the Business School, the Population Health Initiative, the East Science Institute, and the Associate Provost for Research at the University of Washington. And I'd like to turn it over to Jessica to make a brief announcement before we continue.
Yeah, I'm going to pop in the chat here. Any of you students who want to join Siders for a discussion after their talk, it'll be hosted by our student host, Arya Rajoria, who many of you know. And we'll pop this link back in the chat at the end of seminar as well. Thanks, Anne.
You're welcome, Jessica. So I have the great pleasure of introducing our guest speaker today. Dr. A.R. Siders is an assistant professor at the University of Delaware, in the Disaster Research Center, the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration, and the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment, and co-director of the Manjone Climate Change Center and Policy Hub. She holds a JD from Harvard Law School and a PhD from the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources at Stanford University. Siders previously served as an environmental fellow at the Harvard University Center for, Harvard University Center for the Environment, a legal fellow at the Sabine Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University, where she worked on post-Sandy recovery and storm hardening policies, and as a presidential management fellow with the U.S. Navy, where she worked on international engagement in Africa, Task Force Energy, and Task for Climate Change. Her current work focuses on climate change adaptation and on fairness in adaptation. Before I turn the floor over to her, I'd like to remind you to please use the Q&A function to ask any questions. The chat is disabled, so please use this Q&A function, and we will be monitoring it. So if you have any clarifying questions, Siders has said that she's happy to accept them, but any substantive questions should be held for the end of her talk. She'll talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A following that. So please feel free to enter your questions along. If you have urgent questions, please flag them as a clarifying question. And with that, we have the pleasure of hearing Dr. Siders speak today on ethical dilemmas in relocation as climate change adaptation. Welcome, Dr. Siders. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to get my slides up here. I hope that bio answered everyone's questions. If you have questions about what discipline I'm in, that should only have confused the issue further, which is just about right for where my research sits. I'd also like to start my own land acknowledgement. So the University of Delaware sits on the traditional home of the Lenni Lenape and the Nanticoke tribal nations, the Delawares nations. And frankly, we have to do a lot more work to restore those lands and to make reparations to these communities. So with that effort, I'd like to start by talking about my approach to climate change adaptation and one of the major issues here. And because I'm going to think a lot about place attachment, I'm going to start with my hometown. So my hometown is Duluth, Minnesota. It's on the shores of Lake Superior. I have not lived there I was actually trying to figure this out earlier. I have not lived there for about 17 years now. But this is the place that I have the strongest attachment to in the world. And I want to offer this because many people approach climate change adaptation as thinking about how do we address the effects of climate change? And the assumption under that is how do we maintain our existing social infrastructure, physical, ecological systems and environments in the face of a changing climate? And instead, I would like to suggest that you think about our place attachment and the places that we live in as themselves changing over time. Right? These are photos of my hometown throughout time, and you'll notice they're fairly different over time, right? Because my hometown has been changing over the last 100 years, and it will continue to change over the next 100 years. And so when we think about climate change, we're not making a decision about how to maintain our societies in the face of climate change. We're instead making choices about how we want to address that change. This is a framework I really like by Schurman et al. It's coming out of ecological systems. So thinking about how ecologists and natural resource managers are managing ecosystems. And they call it the resist, accept, and direct phrase. And the idea basically is, well, what parts of change do you want to resist? What parts of the current system should we preserve? There are certainly things in all of our hometowns or any place that you care about that we want to preserve, that are important to maintain and to continue through time. But there are also going to be changes that we want to purposefully make, right? We want to purposefully make changes about being more equitable and inclusive. Maybe we want different kinds of more sustainable industries. Maybe we want more walkable cities or just better parking. Whatever it is, there's something that we want to purposefully change. And then there's a range of changes that are just going to happen whether we want to or not, right? Back in 1900, no one thought that I'd be talking to you from the other side of the country on a video sitting in a room in Delaware. 100 years from now, probably, there will be something equally mind-blowing that we cannot predict, but that will change the way our societies work. Maybe there'll be another global pandemic that will make many of us work from home. Maybe it will be climate change. Maybe it will be something totally new. So which changes are we going to pursue? Which are we going to allow to happen? And which are we going to preserve? And the whole point of climate change adaptation as a discipline, in my opinion, is about how we make these choices. So not preserving what we have right now, but thinking more instead about choice architecture and how we make those decisions and how we think about that decision-making process. And notably, this is not an engineering solution. I work with engineers quite a lot and they don't like this slide as much. But this quote I enjoy from a hydrologist working at Johns Hopkins University. And he points out that the question of what you do about our coasts or about any adaptation decision is not a rational conversation. It's not an engineering algorithm that you can solve. Instead, it's a conversation about what we want to be as a society, which is a much messier, more interdisciplinary space that we have to work in and to get lots of voices and perspectives on, because there won't be one answer to that problem. So as we're thinking about these kinds of choices that we're making, I'm really interested in fairness and I'll put equitable or just up here for those of you who prefer to talk about equity and justice. I am a lawyer, so I'm happy to talk about the differences between justice, equity, equality, and fairness. But for the moment, I'm going to use fair in sort of its broadest context, right? That gut sense of what's fair, what do we want? What makes us feel like this is a due process, like this is a just result, this is the kind of solution we want to see, the kind of society we want to build. And I want to think about what this looks like in the adaptation space. Specifically, I tend to use managed retreat as a particular type of adaptation to help me narrow this down. I look at managed retreat because it's highly controversial and because it engages lots of very messy and very personal issues that people have different views on. So one of my big questions that's motivating my research is, what does fair managed retreat look like? And when I talk about managed retreat, I want to put it in the context of other types of adaptation solutions. So I'm often working in the coastal space or in flood-prone areas, and we talk about potential adaptation solutions to flooding and coastal issues. Major categories we talk about, right, are resistance, so preventing the water from coming and affecting a home, or accommodation, the classic example here being elevating your home so that the water can come and go, but it does less damage. So this is reducing your sort of susceptibility to the flood hazard exposure. Retreat, moving away from these highly hazardous areas, not necessarily to a place of no hazard, but to a place of reduced hazard exposure. And then avoidance, like don't build there in the first place, which is something the United States is terrible at. And many places in the world are terrible at, but the United States is particularly terrible at avoiding risk exposure and development. And so these last two are the areas where I spend most of my time thinking about is how do we avoid building in these flood-prone areas, and then how do we make retreat decisions about when to retreat and how to retreat, how to relocate, what does that look like? When I say managed retreat, what I mean is a purposeful, planned, usually government-sponsored, supported movement of people, sometimes other assets like roads, infrastructure, critical facilities, to reduce hazard exposure. So again, moving away from those highly hazardous areas. You may have heard language around this, calling it planned retreat or strategic relocation. My favorite is that we should recall this as aggressive resilience. We could have a whole discussion on what we call this and why managed retreat needs a whole PR campaign to not use the word retreat. I'm a lawyer. I'm happy to talk about semantics. If anyone really wants to get into the naming convention, I will use managed retreat throughout this conversation, primarily because I think it's an accurate description of at least what the US is doing in terms of retreating from these areas. We're not as planned, we're not as strategic, and we aren't really doing relocation. So happy to get into that if people want to in the Q&A. But this is what I mean when I say managed retreat. And notably, managed retreat is a whole category of options. So the same way that resistance is a category of options that includes things like building levees, building seawalls, doing dune renourishment or beach renourishment, putting in retention ponds, living shorelines, There's a whole category of options here. When we talk about retreat, there is a whole category of options here. It could be autonomous retreat that isn't managed. It could be migration, maybe that is managed or is not managed. It could be a whole community relocation. It could be a voluntary property acquisition or a buyout. It could be life estates, leasebacks, all kinds of different programs that could fall into this category. I usually end up talking about buyouts and property acquisitions because that's mostly what is done in the United States. But I just want you to recall that this is in fact a whole category. So don't think that there's just one policy option here. That's going to be an issue. So my original question, right? What does a just or a fair managed retreat look like? What does that look like? And the spoiler alert here is that no one knows. We don't have an answer here. Or actually, what I should have said here is that many people have an opinion, many people have thoughts on this, and most of those opinions are contradictory. So most of those opinions don't agree on what this looks like. And I actually think this is really important. And I think this is really important because there's a theoretical level at which we think about justice. Right? There's a lot of theoretical literature on justice. There's a lot of theoretical literature on environmental justice in particular in this area, or on climate justice even more focused. Those literatures do not agree and do not provide guidance for many of the actual decisions that decision makers need to make in order to make choices about how do we preserve, how do we accept, or how do we direct the changes that we are going to experience due to climate change and other sources of change. And if they cannot guide those decisions, then frankly, there's a question about, are they useful, right? And if they're not useful, how can we improve on them and make them more useful? So to do this analysis, I like to really ground things in the actual decisions. I think a lot about the decision maker, right? Imagine the mid-level bureaucrat who's sitting in a town government office or sitting at a federal government office somewhere and has to make actual choices. Has to decide how to design a policy, has to decide which community members to engage, which stakeholders to hear perspectives from, has to decide what timeline they're going to use, how much money to spend, right? Someone has to make those hard choices. So what information are we giving them about how we would like to see those decisions made in the future? How could they make them better and more fair, more equitable, more just? So when we think about a buyout process, I'm going to use this example. Like I said, it's not the only way we do managed retreat in the US. I need to hammer that home. But this is the most common way we think about this in the US. So a classic sort of baseline buyout process in the United States looks something like this. A disaster occurs, so a hurricane hits, right, a community, there is damage to homes. Then we have local government who applies for funding from the federal government or from the state government. If they receive that funding, they then offer buyouts to certain homeowners, and I will specifically to property owners, not just to residents. They offer them to the property owners. Those owners decide whether or not they want to sell and relocate. If they do sell, then they move. Usually the home is demolished. Sometimes it's relocated, but often it's damaged and so it's demolished. And then the land is maintained as open space, ideally to provide community benefits as a park or to provide flood mitigation benefits as, say, like a restored wetland. This is the very vanilla buyout format upon which there are an infinite number of variations. So if you have an example in your mind that is different from this in some way, yes, there are many variations upon this. This is sort of, as I said, the very big standard. And the challenge with this big standard is that it has dilemmas and decisions that have to be made at every single level, and it has equity and fairness implications at every single one of these decision standards. So, for example, whose homes are damaged by a disaster? Who lives in the floodplain? Who lives along the coasts? These are often informed by past practices such as redlining and racial discrimination, history of enslaved peoples, history of relocating indigenous peoples, decolonialization, if we think more broadly about who's living in exposed areas. In the United States, one of the best predictors of whether or not you will be exposed to a natural hazard like a hurricane or an earthquake or some other disaster is whether or not you are white. So if you are not white, you are more highly likely to experience one of these hazards and to experience damage from it. We can also think about this in terms of the housing, right? Which houses are new? Which houses have been built to a more recent building code? Which ones have more additional protective measures against them? So who is being exposed can be a function of lots of different social decisions that have been added up over time, which is why the disaster field has this movement of saying no natural disasters, right? We don't call these natural disasters. We'll say natural hazard, but not a disaster, because a hazard only becomes a disaster because of all of the social decisions we've made along the way. Hopefully that's not a surprise to many of you on the call, but I feel a need to say that one explicitly. Then we think about the local government and how they're going to make decisions, or they're going to ask for resources. Well, there's a huge debate right now about how should the federal government allocate resources to local governments. Which local governments have the capacity to jump through bureaucratic red tape, to navigate processes, fill out documents, gather data information, and present it in a compelling way in order to get resources. There's some emerging evidence suggesting that, not surprisingly, the governments that have capacity to, say, hire external consultants or hire additional staff or pursue better software or data management systems are more likely to receive federal aid. The challenge is that those might not be the communities who need the aid the most. So how do you get the aid to the communities who need it the most, and how do you define need in this context? There's a huge equity implication there. Once a federal government gets the money, then you have to wonder, how are they going to decide which homes to buy out? Huge equity implications here. Do you offer to buy out more homes at a lower price, or do you offer to buy out fewer homes at a higher price? I'll specifically get into that dilemma a little later on, but how do you decide how you want to allocate the funding that you have been given? How are the homeowners making decisions? There's some really interesting research here looking at how homeowners think about making these decisions, how they think about place attachment and social decisions, the influence of their neighbors, the influence of their the tenure, that the length of time that they've lived in their current home. Whether or not they've renovated recently is actually a good predictor of whether or not they will take a buyout, which is one reason that many buyout officers try to get offers out very quickly. But then that has this trade-off of, if you get buyouts very quickly, immediately after a disaster, are you sort of preying upon people's emotional fragility and maybe the sense of being overwhelmed in the immediate aftermath of a disaster when they have many other decisions to make? So there's trade-offs here between trying to leverage windows of opportunity versus not pressuring people into accepting these offers. And then a big question in this area when people are making decisions about should they take buyouts is, well, where are they going to go? One of the reasons I don't call this relocation and I think about retreat is that relocation, in my opinion, includes both a to and a from. So you're moving from the coast to somewhere else. Currently, US buyout programs do not have a to somewhere else. They have a, here I've bought your house, here's your check, good luck finding a new house. That's it, like hands-off approach. And that's very much because we respect people's individual choices on wanting to choose their own home. And we don't want government intervention to say, move from here to here, because the US has such a terrible history of how that has turned out when the government has tried to relocate people from somewhere to somewhere else. But most cities also have an affordable housing crisis right now. So if you're buying up affordable homes in the floodplain, are you building new affordable homes? Where are you building them? Do they have equitable access? Do they have equitable schools? All kinds of implications there. And of course, how the land is being used or maintained after the fact. There's good research by Elise Devar from University of North Texas looking at how land is used after buyouts. And the reality is that most of it is not used at all. It's just a derelict lot with some unmown grass. Maybe it's mowed, but that's it. And there's a real equity implication in which towns are able to provide the resources, because federal government does not provide resources to turn the land into something else. It just provides resources to remove the home. So which towns have the resources to turn that land into a park, to restore the wetland, to do something useful and beneficial with that land? And then who decides what is useful or beneficial? And if you create green spaces that are useful and beneficial, do you then change the housing pricing around that area? Do you then contribute to gentrification? Do you have other knock-on effects from that decision? So a long slide, I know, a long walk to a short answer, which is every single stage of this buyout process has equity implications and fairness decisions. And it has real choices that have to be made by a practitioner who wants to implement one of these policies. And it has real choice implications for the homeowners and the options that will be available to them to deal with the risk that they are facing. So these aren't just theoretical issues. And if all of that wasn't complicated enough, don't really feel the need to read anything on this slide. What I'd like you to take away from this slide is that this is a really complicated issue. This is the figure from one of the most recent papers I put out looking at why this is such a complicated issue. I'm calling it the administrator's dilemma, but the idea that we have these dilemmas, things like, where should you offer adaptation? Well, is it a harm or a benefit? We don't know. Therefore, how do you do this? And the fact is that this creates a sort of spiral where many of the decisions that we can't answer, we answer by knocking onto a different question. But that question is unanswered, so that has another question, and that creates another question, and eventually it loops back, and we sort of end up chasing our own tails rather than advancing in a way that is progressive. So for example, to break this down, when we think about is managed retreat distributed fairly, we can talk about many different aspects of environmental justice. One of the classics is distribution, right? We want an equitable distribution of benefits and harms when we think about social goods or social amenities or about toxins and other harms. So managed retreat, how is it distributed? This is just one look at one type of managed retreat program. These are FEMA funded, so Federal Emergency Management Agency funded buyout programs across the United States. And you'll note that they're all over the United States. So every single state has done a buyout. Every single state but Hawaii has used FEMA buyouts, and FEMA has used HUD buyouts. So every single state has engaged in some type of buyout or property acquisition property. And you'll see they're spatially clustered. Not surprisingly, they're clustered around many of the large rivers, as you would expect, right around the Mississippi, Missouri, and then along the coasts where you see a lot of flooding and a lot of coastal issues happening, especially in the Gulf with hurricanes. But it's fairly well spread. So we looked at who gets these buyouts, comparing at a county level, who gets these buyouts, looking at various factors such as income and the density of the population. And what we find is that county level, counties that engage in buyouts are more likely to be dense and have a higher income relative to counties within the same state that do not engage in buyouts. And what we think is happening here is exactly what I described. Oh, that's skipping ahead. One of the things I described, exactly what I said here, is that these are high capacity administrators. So these are the towns that, because they're denser, because they're wealthier, they have more money to hire additional staff, to hire expert staff who might demand a higher salary, to hire consultants, to engage in software, to do all kinds of things that would then enable them to receive more federal aid. And because they can receive more federal aid, they are more likely to get buyout funding after a disaster and be able to engage in these buyouts. One of my examples here is New Jersey, where we've recently been doing work. New Jersey's Office of Emergency Management is wonderful. They have a very large staff, and they have particularly hired staff who have former experience in administering FEMA grants. They are therefore, not surprisingly, very successful in receiving FEMA grants. They receive about 11% of the funding compared to of the FEMA funding available, compared to the fact they represent only 3% of the population and 0.01% of the coast. They receive significantly more money than their neighbor New York, even though New York might have an equal amount of exposure and supposed capacity, but they have very particular capacity in that they have this sort of expertise. So the trade-off, though, is that within that county, so once a county gets finances from the federal government, who do they provide those buyout offers to? And so here we use the zip code as an ease, because that's the smallest unit at which buyout data is publicly available at the time when we published the study. That was the smallest unit of analysis we could get at. So when we look at the zip code analysis within the county relative to that county, we find that the buyouts are being offered in lower income areas of relatively less dense population. An example, which isn't accurate for a variety of reasons, but helps illustrate this point, is that when New York gets money, New York City gets money for buyouts, they don't buy out property in Manhattan. Instead, they do buyouts on Staten Island, where you can buy up more homes for a lower price. So it's slightly less dense and the homes are slightly less valuable than other parts of the city. So that's the kind of trend we're seeing across counties across the United States, is buying up these areas. And the million-dollar question is this a bad thing? Is this unfair? Right? Is this a concern that we should have? And so this begs the question. We have news reports. When we reported these statistics, we saw news reports that would come out and say things like, this is horrific because these buyouts are favoring, right, these dense white counties. On the other same time, well, no, but we're not relocating people who really need the support. And at the same time, you can get reports coming out and saying, oh, but we don't want buyouts that are targeting lower income neighborhoods. We don't want buyouts that are targeting racial minorities. So this is a major concern. And so basically, either way you have it, people are unhappy. And so what is the fair split? And one of the reasons that this divided opinion arises is that you have this big debate in terms of, is relocation a benefit or a harm? And this is true for managed retreat, but anyone who's working in the migration space or community relocation or any other type of relocation, social mobility, and this is a complicated question. Is retreat a benefit or a harm? And this is important because environmental justice theory is pretty good at allocating harms and benefits if you talk about like toxins or social amenities, but it's not good at addressing things that are both benefits and harms to the same person. So this is problematic because moving is a really multifaceted issue, right? Everyone working in this space knows this, but this is a really multifaceted issue. So as you move your home, it might have financial implications, both for you, for your children, for your family, intergenerational finances. Where you move can really implicate that. For your physical safety, are you in a floodplain? Are you in another hazardous zone? How safe is the home that you are moving into? What building code standard has it been built to? What about the community who remains after some people relocate and other people don't? Are we worried about their trade-offs, their social connections? How do we balance things like emotional stress of living in a flood-prone area, the fear of having another disaster impending? How do we compare that against the social ties of moving along? And these are all complicated issues on which we don't have great answers. And we particularly don't have great answers in the managed retreat space. And one of the areas that I think is going to be fascinating to dig into in the coming years is to try to tease out what results are due to relocation as inherently, because relocating has, say, severed place attachments, and which aspects are due to the managed retreat aspects. So which parts are due to, say, the government policy and how the government policy was implemented, and which are personal characteristics about how I, as an individual, respond to place attachment or respond to government interactions. And I think eventually we're going to have to tease those out in order to figure out which parts can the policy improve and which parts might we need to improve through other interventions or other support systems. But when we think about some of these things, like the data on how buyouts affect people is actually pretty mixed. So just thinking about physical safety, about 20% of relocation, people who take buyouts appear to relocate in the floodplain. Now, this is based on one sample size. So remember that map where we have buyouts across the United States? There are actually about 1,200 counties that have engaged in buyouts, but we only have data from 2 buyouts on where people relocated after the buyout. And one of them, McGee et al., suggests that about 20% of them relocate in the floodplain. Is that a good ratio? I don't know. So that's an interesting question, right? On the other hand, the other way to phrase that is like 80% of them didn't relocate in the floodplain. So maybe that's a success story, or maybe that's a problem because we think 20% is too high. If we look at trade-offs between emotional stress and social ties and placement, I think this is an interesting one because there do seem to be trade-offs here. So Koslov et al. Had a recent paper come out that was fascinating because it looked at people who stayed after Sandy and people who relocated after Sandy and compared their emotional stress levels and their social ties. And they actually found that people who stayed had increased stress because they were worried about what would happen the next time it flooded, because they were concerned about how they were going to deal with the financial impacts and all the other hazards that come from living in a hazardous place. So staying in a risk-prone area has mental health implications just as much or maybe more than moving does. We don't know. Not enough research being done on comparing these types of relocation. So that's important. Social ties and place attachment, we know change over time. So that's a really interesting one where we're going to need more temporal studies. We know that people have a loss of place attachment and a loss of social cohesion right after they relocate. But we also know from displacement studies from disasters that that changes over time, not surprisingly, right? Most of the estimates are that about 3 years after someone is displaced, they start building new social ties that replace their old ones that they've severed. Well, the longest study we have on managed retreat in the United States is 3 years later that's looked at social ties. So I don't know, will it change over time, right? If we have longer longitudinal studies, will we start to see that trend and how these change over time? Or will we continue to see that once those ties are severed, the harm is irrevocable? This will be an interesting area to try to dig into more and to make comparisons, again, to other types of relocation where more research has been done on these. We have financial issues about moving to social mobility. And this is an interesting one as well, because the jury seems to be sort of out on how relocation affects. There's on the one hand, good research suggesting that people who relocate after a flood-prone buyout might move to areas of higher poverty, which would have implications for for their intergenerational financial mobility and income earnings, but also is important to think about how it affects the town who remains, right? So we think about the people who remain, it also has financial implications for them. So when we're thinking about this, we have to think about what happens to the people who stay. And this is interesting because their place attachment might be the reverse, right? Even if they stay in place, but other people move, their place attachment, their social connections, their financial stability will also be affected, even though they have not relocated. So right now, these programs are all treating these decisions as though they are made by individuals, or rather they're made by households. But in fact, they are very interconnected, and we're not seeing decision-making processes that embrace that interconnectivity and talk about how we should be thinking about that. Let's skip over the ecosystems bit. It's very tempting with all of this complexity to say that the answer to all of these problems, and like CSDEs, you should stop spending time on this because the answer is very clearly that we should let the community decide. And that's great, and this is where I get to use my Star Wars meme, that's a trap because it sounds overly simplified, right? This is great, the community should decide. But saying that the community should decide is the starting point of the conversation. It is not the answer to any of the questions that I have posed. It is just the starting point of the conversation, because the next question you should immediately ask is, well, who is the community? And here, the relocation of Ile de Jean Charles, a tribal community in southern Louisiana on the island of Jean Charles, is a great way to show how complicated this is. The Venn diagrams of the tribe and the people who live on the island are not 100% overlapping. So who is the community in this context? Is it the people who live on the island, including the guy who is not a member of the tribe? Is it the tribe, including the members who do not live on the island and maybe have not lived on the island for quite some time? Is it the other tribe, the Huma Nation, who also claims historic and cultural ties to the island? And actually, these two tribes share a lot of common history and were once the same tribe before they split. And they split partly because they were not granted federal recognition as tribes. And so what role does federal discrimination in recognizing Indigenous communities and recognizing tribal sovereignty play in complicating this issue? But if we can't make a decision about who the community is in the context of an island and a tribal nation, how much more complicated is it to try to identify the community when you're talking about a particular neighborhood, right? Defining those lines around that neighborhood becomes very complicated, and it seems to depend upon who you ask, right? Who your initial entry point into the community might then shape your entire stakeholder engagement network. And so does that create a comprehensive picture of the community? Even if you can identify the community, then you have to have questions about how the community is going to make those decisions. Are they going to vote and the majority will win and the minority will, embrace the decision of the majority, or do they have some other decision-making process? And this becomes important for the effects of relocation on the community. I love this example from Ellicott City, Maryland. It's a historic town that was considering buyouts after two very deadly floods in the town in short succession. Right, and one neighbor quoted on the top says, I really embrace the historic nature of this town and it's worth fighting for. Their neighbor next door, who they used to be friends, says, look, if you pretend that human lives are worth less than a historical building, you're a despicable person. And I don't have any bones about saying that. You're absolutely despicable. Notably, she didn't have any bones about saying that to National Public Radio and naming her neighbor in that. So this idea that making the decision isn't always an amicable process. So how do you engage the community, define the community, and then make the decision as a community without re-traumatizing people, without contributing to the post-traumatic stress disorder that some people in this community are experiencing, without contributing to the financial insecurity that will be caused if part of the community relocates and the tax base is reduced in these areas? What also do we do when we think about people who stay, right? Like, are there consequences for choosing not to relocate? These are two examples from Florida. On the right is a sort of a classic legal case, or classic. It's become a star in the legal realm because of its ramifications. These homes that are circled there basically sued the county to say that the county had to maintain that road that's right along the beach, even though the homes were built after the county had decided not to maintain that road. Should they be able to do that? The cost of maintaining that 1.5 miles of road is more than the county's entire budget for road maintenance. Should it legally have to put it into that area? Should it have to raise taxes for the entire county in order to maintain roads for those homes? What are the equity implications of being required to provide services to homes that are in risk-prone areas? Similarly, this is the picture in the middle is Dauphin Island, Alabama. It's been rebuilt about 16 times using federal tax dollars. The estimates are something like that residents have paid in $9 million in flood insurance claims, but have received $72 million in flood insurance payouts, plus an additional $80 million in disaster funds. And those numbers are about 8 years old, so I'll bet they're higher now. So what do you do about that, right? Like, is it fair to continue to subsidize people living in areas that we know are risk prone? Should we do it forever? Like, is there a point at which you don't rebuild people's homes? There's a home in Mississippi that the federal government has paid $600,000 to rebuild 34 times in the last 32 years. It's worth $60,000. Should we rebuild it 50 times, 100 times, infinite? Like, is there a stopping point? And if there is a stopping point, where is it? What's the tipping point? Is it we just wait until the homeowner doesn't want to be there anymore? I honestly don't know if that's the same homeowner over those 34 times. I'm really curious. For privacy reasons, we can't get data on who that homeowner is or where that home is, but I would love to know things like why they decided to build for the 30th time, or if they just sold it to someone else and then let them accept the risk, which might be what's happening here too. So that would be interesting. When we think about these dilemmas, right? I know this can all sound very sort of abstract, right? But at some point, someone, like I said, that some decision maker has to sit down and make decisions about things like, how do you decide literally on a map, you're going to draw out, you are going to put circles around certain homes, and certain homes you are going to offer to buy out and other homes you are not. How will that decision be made? Even if you, the decision maker, are not making it, maybe you're passing the buck to the community and saying, hey, community, you decide. How will the community decide which houses get offers and which ones don't? And then how much money will you offer them? You can buy, if you have a fixed budget, which I am taking it as an assumption, and that is an assumption. The budgets may get larger, and we could hope that they do, but I am making an assumption that the budgets will never be infinite, that they will always be fixed, and therefore they will always require some level of prioritization or some level of trade-offs between the number of homes that you can purchase and the amount of money you can provide. Do you provide more support to fewer people? Do you provide less support to more people? And I can identify particular programs that have taken different approaches to this. There are programs that pride themselves on being lean. They say we don't have much overhead. We don't provide all the bells and whistles that other programs do, which is why we can buy homes more cheaply, which is why we can buy more homes. And so we can help more people who want to get out of these flood-prone areas, get out of these flood-prone areas. And there are other communities who say, nope, we buy very few homes. We operate very slowly, which means that many homeowners who want to be bought out cannot be bought out. But the homeowners that we do buy out have additional resources to be able to find good housing and able to find support systems. Which approach is more fair? I don't know. And this is the area where I think it would be really interesting, and I'm trying to get more empirical data on how do we think about these problems, right? How do we evaluate which of those is better? What criteria are we using to think about which one of those is better? What does the community think about which of those is better? What do the participants think about this, right? Does it matter? Can we show statistically that giving people additional money means they are more likely to end up in safe housing outside of a floodplain and be happier with their social connections? If not, maybe not. Maybe we shouldn't provide that additional money. But if so, can we show that that value add actually made a difference in where they live? Yeah, so Henry, I'll talk about insurance when we get to that, but definitely being priced out where people are moving. This is a big issue. People often are priced out of sometimes rebuilding, especially if they have to rebuild to higher damage thresholds. So these buyouts are voluntary in most contexts. There are a few contexts that are not voluntary, but that get at rebuilding restrictions, and I'll try and get at that in the Q&A. Let me skip that one. One of the reasons I think about all of these issues is because I'm struck by this sort of statement, this implicit assumption and often explicit assumption that people should not relocate, that relocation is harmful and that it is an adaptation of last resort. So this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I don't have the corresponding quote up here, but I think it's noticeable that the US National Climate Assessment, the last one that came out, says that relocation is unavoidable in all but the lowest sea level rise projections. So if relocation is unavoidable at some level, then what should we do about that, right? Like, should we consider it a last resort, or does it really have other options? And I think about this because I think a lot about stories of people who want relocation. We recently did interviews with about 30 different practitioners from around the United States who are engaging in buyouts. All of them told us about additional communities who wanted to do buyouts, but were unable to do so because they did not have the administrator capacity. And all of them had wait lists for people who wanted to be bought out, but could not be bought out because they did not have sufficient funding to fund those buyouts. In some communities, we've had people who have been waiting for up to 8 years, probably longer in other areas. I've heard stories of other areas, but I've identified homeowners who have been waiting for at least 8 years for a buyout, right? Who want to be bought out, they want to relocate. The story on the right and the child up on the left, I find particularly heartbreaking because the kids in this household have PTSD. The story reports, right, they cry when it rains because they lived through a major hurricane, they lost their home, they lost all their belongings, they don't want to go through another hurricane, the family doesn't want to go through another hurricane, but they can't afford to sell their home because they'd have to sell it at a financial loss. And there is no buyout being offered. So one of the reasons I think about relocation not as a last resort, but as a real option we have to have on the table is because there are many people who want to relocate. Maybe that means they've reached the point of last resort, but it might also mean that they just prioritize things like the safety and the mental health of their children above their place attachment or above the community that they are in. And that is a decision that we should have policies in place to support as they make those choices. Which brings me back to how we think about big questions about change. And my favorite quote about retreat actually comes from the US Marine Corps general. And so he's pretty famous. This is Oliver P. Smith. He led a very major retreat in the Korean War. And he's sort of famous for this potentially apocryphal quote of retreat hell. We're just advancing in a different direction. And it's very raw and very military. But it's also actually kind of important because I mentioned that this is retreat rather than relocation, because this is us taking a step back from some of these risk-prone areas and thinking about where we should build. But what we don't have right now is we don't have that different direction. We don't have any plans or policies that think about where should we be building and how should we be unbuilding in some areas and building in new areas. We don't have a lot of visions for many of these communities in the US particularly, but also in other areas on what does this community look like in the face of climate change long term. Most of our adaptation planning efforts are still very short term. This is coming from the IPCC assessment that came out this year, and also from the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative. We can show that the mass amount of adaptation around the world is very incremental changes to business as usual, rather than embracing transformation, rather than long-term planning, rather than sort of thinking about the purposeful change that we might see in the future. So as we think about those futures that we might have, right? We have to recall that although I listed in the beginning sort of resistance, accommodation, retreat, avoidance, and I reluctantly include advance on this because of some reviewer 2 comments, but as options for thinking about adaptation, we list them as alternatives, but the reality is that they're not alternatives, right? Those are ingredients that we are going to mix in different ways to create different recipes. And what recipe we create does not depend on the ingredients, it depends on the ratio of those ingredients, right? And it depends on our initial goals. So does a community care more about economic security or disaster reduction or social cohesion or environmental risk or something else? I was just relating the anecdote, but I'm serving on a panel right now that's advising a government agency on things like, where do you put the seawall? Yeah, and a colleague and I have very fundamental differences on, do you put the seawall in front of the residential district or the business district? And we both have good reasons for it, right? But fundamentally, it comes down to things like, what is your main goal? What do you think the goal of flood defense should be? Should it be to maintain economic integrity in the community? And do you think that those economies are fundamental to supporting people's livelihoods and so forth? Or do you think that the role of government really should be to protect individuals and that corporations should take more responsibility for their own protection? What do you think is the role of government? What do you think is the role of adaptation? What do you think is the benefit of a private industry and a market? These are fundamental questions that are not answered by, where do you put the wall? But that must be engaged in order to make that decision in a sort of equitable way. So when we think about these different futures, we have to remember that we're thinking about the goals that we want. And I said we don't have very many long-term plans. One of the things that I really love is by an landscape architect, Rosetta Elkin. She's at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and she talks about a national seashore. So what if we took away all of the coast? And actually, Oregon's a perfect example of this because Oregon has its Beaches Protected Act, which is unusual in the US. So, you're Washington, you could look at Oregon and see if this works in Washington. But consider other states, like, what if we didn't have homes on the coast? What if we had a truly open, public, accessible coast, like the National Seashore Parks that already exist around the US, but that was all of the shore, right? And if you don't like this vision of the coast, that's fine, but I would challenge you to articulate, what is your vision for the coast? What do you want the US coast or the community to look like in 100 years, right? What does it look like? And if not this, that's fine, but something, right? What are we trying to aim towards? And finally, I'm just going to wrap up by thinking about, this has been a very theoretical talk. I know they're sort of at the stage where I'm at in this research right now, this particular line of research. But some of the areas I'm going is trying to turn some of these ideas about how we think about conflicts on equity and fairness into more sort of operationalized empirical work. So working with some modelers and some economists on how we can run experimental designs to look at how people prioritize equity, or how they prioritize trade-offs between economic efficiency for the community and sort of equity for the decision maker, looking at some decision making at transportation networks on how we prioritize adaptation, how do we operationalize equity in those decisions. One of the projects I'm really excited about is a Coastlines and People project. We just started here at the Disaster Research Center, where we're actually going to use 4 different definitions of equity and try to operationalize that within a decision-making optimization model, and then see how that optimization model produces, does it produce different recommendations on how you should adapt based on how you define equity and how you define it and operationalize it. And then as a very final thing, just one of the things I've become interested in is also sort of storytelling. How do we think about storytelling in fiction and nonfiction? So media, but also games and fiction. How do we think about the way we tell stories about climate change and the way we tell stories about the future? How does that influence the visions we have of what we want our future to be? And how does that change our decision about that resist, accept, direct, the choices that we make in this space? So thanks for sticking with me through all of that. Happy to chat and see where you'd like the conversation to go.
Thank you, Siders, for that fantastic presentation. We have one question already, and I'm going to encourage other people to raise their hands, or excuse me, not raise your hands, put your answers in your questions in the Q&A function, and we will try to call on you. Before I open up and ask Henry if he wants to ask his question in person, you did start to address it. You said you'd say some more, Siders. I'd like to acknowledge also that this talk was co-sponsored by the Cascadia Coastlines and Peoples Hazards Research Hub. You mentioned Coastlines and Peoples project, so we'll come back to that later, and also by the Population Health Initiative at the University of Washington. So I see a hand up too. Jessica, do you want to?
Yeah, I do have a question, but if you want to continue to address Henry's question, if you have anything else to say, and Henry, I'm going to give you the ability to unmute if you'd like to ask anything further, and then maybe I can ask my question.
Henry, if you want to add anything, please jump in. Otherwise, yes, thanks for giving me a second to think about the response to your question. So think about people being priced out due to rebuilding costs and flood insurance. So two pieces here. One is rebuilding can be extremely costly. And this is actually a reason, the fact that these prices are going up is actually a reason that I think we need to offer more buyouts as an alternative. Because there's been a big emphasis on increasing the price of flood insurance. Sorry, I should back up. Hoping everyone knows that flood insurance in the United States is largely subsidized by the US government through the National Flood Insurance Program. So although homeowner insurance covers other things like wind damage, flood damage is usually government subsidized. There are some exceptions to that. That's fairly common. And right now, there are major bills being proposed in terms of how to fix the National Flood Insurance Program, many of which focus on increasing premium prices. So if the prices go up, this pressure on people is only going to increase. And one of the things I think we need to do there is give people another option. So we can subsidize and keep prices low, but on some level that keeps people to live in flood-prone areas. And so I think long-term, that's a problem. So if we are going to increase flood insurance prices and ask people to take on more risk, I think we also need to give them an option to leave if they would rather not carry that risk and they would rather not sell on the private market and pass the buck, so to speak, to another family who would then have to carry that risk and that development ownership. So the rebuilding pressures are also an issue depending on when they are required to rebuild to a higher standard, if they are required to, say, elevate their home. There's a lot of detail there in terms of how those decisions are made on hitting a significant damage threshold. There's a heck of a lot of homes that are considered 49% damaged, which is not a significant damage threshold, and very few that are 51% damaged, which is. And a lot of that seems to be due to politics and power more so than actual damage assessment. So there's also a political and a power dynamic going on here, and frankly, a discrimination pattern that seems to be going on here. A systemic discrimination pattern here in terms of who is getting those hit with those rebuilding requirements that can be so expensive, like elevation. I'm not sure that was a very articulate response to that. Sorry, Henry, but I hope that answered your question.
No, that was a great response, and I appreciate it very much. This whole issue has become moved from being a theoretical issue for me to being one where my family is hit. And so, yeah, I'm in some kind of daily contact, and my sister met at the house. They had to get there in a canoe with FEMA and Allstate. And the two insurers divided the house by the height of the walls, right? From here up is Allstate and from here down is FEMA. It's quite complex. And yeah, the idea of where to go is very difficult. Thank you very much. I'm going to follow your work. I really appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thanks for that. And I will note that divide between the two insurers can be problematic because there's also good evidence that it can slow down the process of people getting money. If you have to go into a damaged house and try to figure out how much of the house was damaged by wind and how much was damaged by floodwater after a hurricane, right? There are ways to do that, but it takes more time and it's more complicated. And so, yeah, so there are a lot of arguments for reforming the insurance industry in this area. Just that no one agrees on how. Yeah.
Thank you, Sliders. Jessica, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I think my question is kind of a good follow-up to that. So I've done just a minimal amount of work with this at the local level in King County and trying to understand some inequities in housing and preparation and mitigation. And one thing that we found is that, well, one, referring to Henry's second question, that King County actually, and I'm sure this is true of many counties, uses a different floodplain map than FEMA. And while there are restrictions on building in our local floodplain, those don't line up. So there are still buildings in the 100-year floodplain, but they're not classified as such locally. And I'm not sure at what level of jurisdiction that's decided, but my main question, and something that really concerned me as we were digging into this, is the disparity in planning, protections, and a totally different consequence of all of these incentive structures for renters versus homeowners. And in homeowner, we have FEMA buyouts, we have all of this for homeowners. Landlords are not actually incentivized to take those up. And in fact, different kind of flood insurance. Do you know any, like on the national scale, or is any of your work really, thought about this or found anyone sort of thinking about the renters of the country?
Yeah, so there's a lot of thought about it, but a lot of good solutions on it, I think. So one of the big issues, particularly with buyouts, is that buyout decisions are made by the property owner, so the landlord. They are not made by the tenant. And in fact, tenants are compensated under a totally different structure. So tenants are compensated under Uniform Relocation Act, which governs mandatory relocations like eminent domain condemnation and involuntary acquisitions like this. So they are compensated under a totally different schedule. But there are lots of complications like, well, should they get a say? Particularly if you have sort of an absentee landlord and the resident has been a long time member of the community, right? This goes back to how do you define the community? Are renters part of the community? Well, that kind of depends on who the renters are as well. Right? I mean, well, I don't want to say like depends on who the renters are, but say the longevity of it, right? Living in college towns, right? Are college students considered part of the community? Some of our community members would say yes, absolutely, and others would say definitely not because they're here for 4 years and then they leave. So there's this interesting tension of who counts, right? And especially when you're thinking about renters. The assumption is that renters have less place attachment and are more mobile. That's probably a false assumption in a lot of cases, but how do we make that? A lot of programs that I have seen in the buyout space avoid buying up tenant houses because they want to avoid the renter issue entirely. And I think that creates a whole additional equity implication where you have lots of homes that are being rented out, that are in flood prone areas and probably should be part of a buyout process and relocated because they're not safe, but are not because we don't have a good way to deal with the renters. There's also an interesting piece of this on flood disclosure, right? Like who's told about their flood risk. So the administration has just announced its intention to pursue legislation that would make it mandatory to disclose flood risk to renters. Disclosing flood risk to even property buyers is not required in many states, like Florida, who's recovering from Hurricane Ira. So there's really interesting questions about how do we disclose risk? So who's making informed decisions about their property pieces there? So I haven't seen any good solutions. Lots of discussion about the problems, though.
Thanks.
Super. We have another question here from Aaron Ferguson. Aaron, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
hey.
Great. I didn't realize I could unmute until I saw the prompt. Yeah, my question is around the intersection of climate change resilience, focused migration, work on climate change resilience, focused migration, and whether there's any intersection with other forms of migration, literature and work on them, such as migration from human conflicts. Especially looking forward to the future and how those might become more intertwined as circumstances advance.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you. I am also looking forward to that. There should be much better integration between looks at climate-induced relocation of a variety of ways and other types of relocation. And I mean that both for, I think the migration literature is really important. I think shrinking cities literature is going to be really important, right? As we see shrinking populations in some areas and we think about how we densify or urban sprawl, right? Efforts to think about smart city planning are probably going to have climate change context as well. A lot of areas like this that are focused on people relocating or where people build, how we provide incentives to where people live or don't live. At what level do we try to prevent the drivers of migration, or what point do we try to support migration as it's occurring? Right now, not good integration across these literatures. And I think that's partly because climate change sits in this odd space. And so you have people like myself who are not migration scholars, right, trying to enter this space, but from a very particular sort of governance lens, thinking about this. I'm working with migration scholars on some of these issues, but this is an area where I think we have a lot to learn, particularly how we assess things like how does it affect people's long-term, right, mental health and place attachments to places they're not living, and how do you maintain continuity even after you've relocated, right? I think there's a lot to be learned here in terms of how we assess these things and how we think about what support systems are there. And a conversation we were just having is also, I think we need to think really carefully about what is it about climate relocation that we think is unique. So what aspects should be handled under a unique climate response government policy, right? Like, should UNFCCC be dealing with these things, or should this be an IOM, right, concept, right? I mean, at an international level, but also at the US level, right? Like, should this be dealt with by FEMA or by HUD, I tend to come down on the HUD side of things because I think housing and urban development might be a better organization to deal with long-term urban housing and development patterns than emergency response. But right now, much of it is being dealt with under emergency management. And so what does that mean? Like, what are the implications of a government agency that's focused on disaster response dealing with long-term housing issues? So I think in some ways I hope we will see more of a transition to thinking about relocation and resettlement as a long-term strategy. And hopefully that means we will see different governance structures and a lot more overlap with those areas. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. And we'll make it happen. I don't know. Yeah. It's just there.
Thank you, Siders. We are just about at time. Do we have time for one more question, Jessica?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so.
Okay. And this is from Dwayne Plaza. Dwayne, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sorry, my bad. Working on it.
It's under Allie. Yeah.
No, thank you.
Oh, okay, that was sounds like a no.
Fine.
Thank
Like I can summarize. So yeah, so I think this is a really, the race and income pieces are really important. And I think like one of the projects we did in North Carolina looked at where buyouts are being allocated in relation to where beach nourishment is happening and where seawalls are being built. And that's one of the things I think about is really important when we think about relocation, especially to climate change. We need to think about it in the context of other adaptation decisions, because what we see is a pretty clear segregation. Not surprisingly, we're not buying out homes in the same places that we're building seawalls. But what was important in North Carolina is that we showed, statistically speaking, walls are being built in front of rich white people's homes, beach nourishment is happening in front of really rich white people's homes, and relocation is happening in lower income African-American communities, right? Like, so we're seeing that disparity. And this suggests, we don't know, right? Like I can't see anything causal from that correlation, but we can suggest some things like, right, why is it not happening there? And I propose that it's because things like you don't build $1 million flood wall in front of a $100,000 home, you build $1 million flood wall in front of $1 million home. Well, who owns that $1 million home? And who owns that $1 million home is going to be shaped by our long history of segregation and discrimination in housing prices, right? And building that wall actually perpetuates that discrimination because building that wall probably increases the value of the home that is protected behind that wall, and therefore continues to increase the wealth inequality between the people who are protected and the people who are not, right? Beach nourishment, very similarly, we protect beaches in areas that are considered high value beaches. Where are the high value beaches? Well, they're in front of things like $1 million hotels, right? And places where tourists want to go. They're not in areas that have more, maybe potentially more ecosystem value. So how we think about those decisions being trade-offs, I think, is actually really important. And one of the things I think is really interesting is that across the US, actually, there are 4 studies that have looked at how buyouts correlate with race, and they have found 4 different answers. So I can tell you that buyouts are going to areas of like counties of higher wealth and zip codes of lower wealth, but I cannot tell you whether that necessarily correlates with race in those areas because 4 studies have found competing patterns at a national level and at a national level over time. So like the jury's still out. One of the solutions to this that has been proposed is that FEMA and HUD should start tracking that data. Like they do not collect that data right now. They should start collecting that data so that we can actually answer that question. Are buyouts having a different pattern racially? We think so, but like, it'd be really nice to have the data to know it, right? Like, so we'd like that. So I think some of this is going to have to be, we look at in more detail as we can get data at a finer grained level.
Fantastic answer and call for more research. So thank you very much, Siders, for this really
As
wonderful
all good
presentation.
academics do, right? Yes.
We really appreciate your talk today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And those of y'all who are attending the discussion, I've just popped the link in the chat.